People like to say Africa's presidents are compromised. They say African leaders are puppets because they studied or trained in the global north, that if you went to school in Europe, America, or a foreign military academy, you must be controlled. And while that framing may sound plausible, it's also oversimplified. First, let's be clear. Going abroad or being trained outside Africa is not inherently useless, but that only works if an African foundation comes first. What external training can add, not replace, is visibility into how power operates within institutions through administration, gatekeeping, and quiet enforcement. So, when it's added on top of a strong African foundation, external exposure can sharpen strategy, clarify how global systems function, and reveal hidden agendas inside institutions with firsthand knowledge. Now, with that context established, Africa doesn't need to go abroad to learn how white supremacy works. It has operated on African soil for centuries through extraction, borders, proxy wars, sanctions, and structural punishment. So, this is not a story about discovery. And that difference matters because understanding power is not about where you studied, it's about where your loyalty lies, who your allegiance is to, and whether the knowledge you gain is used to advance African interests or quietly repackaged to maintain external systems and structures while Africa pays the cost. That's the line, that's the difference, and that's the real question this episode is asking. Education isn't the issue, alignment is. And remember, if you want more Africa First stories that Western media ignores, hit subscribe. We don't chase the headlines, we chase the truth. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Africa's leadership problem is not ignorance. It's an unfinished allegiance system. So, let's talk reality. Across Africa, from Ghana to Kenya, from Senegal to Ethiopia, modern leadership has been shaped inside global systems. Presidents, finance ministers, central bankers, military commanders, they often study abroad. They train in external academies, they work inside donor frameworks, multilateral institutions, and security partnerships. There's effectively no category untouched by this history. Not civilians, not soldiers, not monarchs. This wasn't coincidence. Colonialism didn't just extract resources, it restructured elite formations. Africa lost control over how leaders were trained before it regained formal political independence. Sovereignty isn't just about elections. It's about who shapes instincts before power is exercised. So people think that if African leaders trained abroad, they must automatically be loyal to the West. Convenient false conclusion. The deeper global context is that white supremacy is not just racial hostility. It's a system of management. It decides who gets access, who gets delayed, who gets tolerated, who gets quietly punished. Africans have confronted this system for generations, economically, politically, militarily. External exposure doesn't teach Africans that the system exists, it shows how it's run. How institutions claim neutrality while enforcing hierarchy, how legitimacy is granted, suspended, or withdrawn, and how funding, visas, partnerships, and credibility quietly disappear. This isn't ideological education, it's operational visibility. And that distinction matters because understanding a system does not equate to loyalty. But allegiance does determine whether that understanding becomes a weapon for sovereignty. So here's the real failure, and it's structural. The problem was never exposure. The problem was allegiance formation. Exposure gives you information. Allegiance determines how you use it. Africa allowed external systems to shape what leaders fear, what they consider realistic or too far. Instead of anchoring leaders first in African political economy, African security priorities, African strategic patience, and many leaders were trained externally and returned without a continental framework to re-anchor their loyalty, right? That doesn't make them evil. It makes them misaligned, ignorant, ill-informed. They came back with technical skills, procedural fluency, global literacy, but no African-controlled system saying, you've seen how power works. Now apply that knowledge for Africa, not for system stability. So this is why some leaders manage crises efficiently, but never build exits from dependency. So what's the correct model going forward? It's not isolation, purity politics, or pretending the world doesn't exist, The answer is sequence and allegiance. So, stage 1, African grounding. Before external exposure, leaders must be anchored in African history, African political economy, African security logic, and African philosophies of power. This establishes loyalty before leverage. Stage 2, strategic external exposure. Then, selectively, leaders engage in external systems to observe institutional behavior, map leverage points, and understand enforcement mechanisms, not to assimilate or seek approval, but to read the room clearly. Stage 3, African application. Leaders must return to African written doctrine, African controlled legitimacy, and continental decision-making spaces. This is where knowledge is applied with African intent. And this can't stay only nationally. Africa needs continental coherence, shared educational standards, aligned leadership training, and portability across African institutions. Not sameness, alignment. And eventually, Africa must ask a serious question. Why does a continent of over 1 billion people still outsource the definition of its military doctrine? We need a continental military academy. African-led, African-written, African-governed. And it isn't extreme. It's unfinished business. And that episode is coming very soon. So Africa doesn't need leaders who have never left. That's not wisdom. That's vulnerability. Africa needs leaders who are grounded here, understand global systems clearly, and apply what they know in our best interest. The issue was never education. The issue was allegiance. So, mashallah, that's your Africa Insight for today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe because I'm Mr.EmpowerTV. We don't chase the headlines, we chase the truth behind them. This is Mr. Empower, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.